While we're waiting for the slides to come up, just wanted to share that what I'm going to be talking about builds on the work that I've been doing in collaboration with Jeff Taft and Lorenzo Christoph on behalf of the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity, and in particular the work I've been doing with under Pacific Northwest National Labs and the Grid Modernization Consortium efforts. Is this slide up, Carrie? Thank you. Next slide, please. I like to use this quote from William Gibson, a sci-fi writer. The future is already here, it just isn't evenly distributed. And that certainly is the case in the United States, where we see the adoption of distributed energy resources and the increasing utilization of those resources, both at the distribution level and in the wholesale markets, has been at the early stages. As we think about where we're going next slide, please. It's useful to think about where we are in the context of, kind of this evolution over the last decade or so with distributed energy. And a lot of the efforts that I've been speaking, and working on with the Department of Energy and engaging a number of you and your organizations has been looking at this transition from what I called stage 1 to stage 2. But now clearly with FERC 2222, we have a pretty clear signpost that we're starting to look ahead towards this future, what I called stage 3. We're clearly still, working our way into stage 2, but as we think about this operational coordination, one of the things I'd like to leave you with today is, although there's some immediate need to solve the issues today, we really ought to be thinking about also where we're heading over the balance of this decade in the use of distributed resources for a variety of purposes. Next slide, please. So I think we all know, and we just heard, we're really looking at how are we sort of expanding the operational relationships across the T&D system. We're really moving away from the old hierarchical system that we've had for many, many years, and now really looking at how do we sort of balance this system across both the transmission, bulk power system, as well as at the distribution level. Next slide, please. But this really requires us to think, pretty deeply about what's involved. So when we talk about operational coordination and what you heard from Dave Cathan, it sounds fairly straightforward on its face. However, we have a very complex system. This diagram just gives you an illustration of the level of relationships and between information flows and transactions and power flows and the like. And when we think about this, as my colleague Jeff Taft likes to say, it's like a tapestry. And if you pull on one of these threads, you start to get bunching up in other areas. So this is a really complex situation, actually. And it means that we need a really thoughtful approach to thinking about the changes that are going to be required to address what FERC 2222 is introducing. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do, and there'll be illustrations that you'll see today, we tend to simplify that complex diagram into some simpler diagrams to sort of, more clearly understand where the key relationships are and the like. And certainly, as we think about, in this example, 3 tiers where you have the transmission system or the bulk power system, the distribution, and the customer level, there's a need to really understand where these key relationships are, what needs to be, the interfaces that are required and the like. Next slide, please. So as we think about these diagrams and having a simpler way of looking at it, the other thing that we developed about 5 years ago was this idea of 3 conceptual models for how we think about this coordination. So in the first case, it's what we call the TotalTSO model. That is where the transmission system operator, in this case, the ISO RTO, would be essentially managing all the resources directly into their market, including for any distribution level services that may be desired, such as a non-wires alternative program, for example, or procurement. There would be a communication with the distribution operator, but essentially everything would be managed by the transmission system operator, including having to have visibility all the way down into the distribution system as well as the controls interface. That's the total TSO model. The next model is the hybrid DSO model, and this is one where we have joint operations. We have the transmission system operator interfacing directly with aggregators, as well as with distribution utilities that would have, say, their programs, and those programs also, or the aggregators also interfacing with the distribution operator to the extent that they're doing a non-wires alternative. Also, to the extent that the distribution utility has an aggregation of resources, either what they're doing with customers or their own resources, as may be the case, say grid storage, they may also be participating directly into that wholesale market. And then there's obviously coordination between the distribution operator and transmission operator. This is essentially the starting point for the FERC 2222 order. What it is basically calling out is this structure as a starting point. And we'll come back to this as we go through the conversation today, but it's important to understand that this is kind of our starting point. This has also been the starting point for discussions around the world. So the work that I'll touch on a little bit later in Australia or in Canada, in the UK and in other parts of Europe, as well as even in Japan, has largely started out with this sort of hybrid structure. It's a natural starting point, but there are issues about this structure as we think about scaling up over time, which I'll touch on. Next slide, please. So the total DSO is another example, and this is sort of the bookend to the total TSO. That is where all the aggregation would be done through a distribution system operator. So all the systems at the distribution would flow up and aggregate, and then the distribution system operator would interface with the transmission system operator in a single point of interface there. So this is another construct that sort of bookends the total TSO. And typically what we find are people talking about variations of a hybrid that tend to go towards more total TSO or more towards total DSO. But as we think about where we're starting from and where we're heading to, I think there's some important considerations in thinking about the concept of this total DSO model. Next slide, please. This just summarizes what I was just describing. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we need to think about are what are the functions that are going to be required across from planning and operations in the market itself. And as we think about the different different models, total TSO, hybrid, and total DSO, you're going to want to be able to understand and think about the implications of who does what under these structures. The DO part is what the distribution utility and their distribution owner function would do. But there are these implications as we get deeper into this in terms of, under the various structures, who does what is an important concept to think about as you think about these coordination models. Next slide, please. There are a number of architectural principles that are pretty important to think about. Observability, the scalability of the construct. Cybersecurity, vulnerability is obviously important. There's a layered decomposition. So how do we think about structuring this? Tier bypassing, which I'll touch on in a moment. Hidden coupling, I'll also touch on, and latency cascading, I'll also touch on in an example. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been doing as part of the work around the country and around the world is looking at a sequence about how to approach these questions that have been posed in the FERC 2222 requirement for developing a coordination framework. So one is, what are we trying to accomplish? So starting with objectives and capabilities. The next is really understanding where you're starting from. So what is the existing or emerging structure that is happening in your area? So what is that current set of relationships? What does that diagram look like that I showed you earlier? Then we start to look at developing alternative structures to really understand what the implications against those principles just I showed briefly. And then we start to think about those alternatives, and we look at the operational effectiveness and potential risks, operational risks and the like. And then there's going to be some implementation requirements and costs associated with any alternative. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly go through here just to show you these steps. So as we think about those capabilities and functions I mentioned before, we start to look at those more specifically and get concrete about what's required and when and at what scale, because that becomes important. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the existing and emerging structure, this is a summary example I'll point you to, and I think I have this in one of the references, but there's some work that I did with ICF Consulting for the Ontario ISO last year, where we decomposed their existing system in the multiple layers between power flows, operational control, market transactions, and then information and data exchange to be able to build up to this diagram here, which represents their existing system. As you can start to see, it is quite complex. Next slide, please. Again, in terms of what the alternative structures are, you're going to look at how in most cases, you're starting in this hybrid, but there's variations on how you might do this. So it's important to really start to think about what those alternatives are that address the various issues that need to be considered from the various stakeholders and obviously from a public policy and regulatory perspective. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, these principles are important. There's a set of effectiveness principles, that is, what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the performance of the overall structure. And there's risk. So there's tier bypassing, where information is bypassing the distribution operator and going directly to the transmission operator. The requirement for an operational control framework, as was mentioned in the FERC presentation earlier, seeks to address this issue. But it's important to really understand where that might arise and avoid, because you don't want two different signals reaching the DER and creating conflicts or having the operation of a resource that might inadvertently create issues on the distribution system and vice versa. Things that the distribution operator is controlling that has impact on the transmission system. So it's very important to have that level of coordination. And it can get fairly complex depending on the number of interfaces that are involved. Hidden coupling is where you can end up with multiple control signals happening, and it isn't always clear that is arising. There's a latency cascading. What this means is if you start to include too many entities in the sequence of information that needs to get passed, then you can start to create a timing problem such that the information doesn't get to the right place at the right time, and you can start to create operational issues. This is particularly important in the real-time, day of operations of the system. Next slide, please. This is an example from Australia, and I put it in here because I think you're going to see some examples later from Anne that are more desirable, but I wanted to give you a bookend of one that isn't desirable and the reasons why. This is one example that came from Australia, AMO perspective. This wasn't accepted by the parties, but it was an example of where they were trying to really extend the idea of a market price only sort of construct with no physical operations involved. It's more of a design concept. It doesn't work for a variety of reasons, and which is called out here. There are some reports that if you're interested, we can provide to you. But But anyway, this is one example of where you could have a total TSO and then trying to provide a fairly complex arrangement of trying to manage both the bulk power system and the distribution system operations through a pricing mechanism directly from the Australian market operator. And as you can see, the distribution network provider, which is their distribution utility, is pretty far over on the left-hand side, not directly facing any of this information. So you've got some pretty significant issues with coordination, physical operations, and visibility to what may be driving the behavior on the distribution system, which is not a scalable solution. Next slide, please. There's some resources here. The ISO valuation is here. The AMO, the international survey that a team of us put together for AMO, which laid out some of the considerations, also did a review of both US market discussions as well as around the world that I touched on. Jeff Taft's grid architecture, which has some of the basic foundational aspects to it. And then the paper that Lorenzo, Christoph, and I developed a few years back for Lawrence Berkeley National Labs on developing these three bookend, sort of the spectrum of coordination models and also the considerations. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass it on to Anne.
Thanks so much, Paul. While they're getting Anne's slides up, I do want to say, I neglected to say thank you. You have gone out and helped many states with their distribution planning on an individual basis. And, I think everybody's grateful for the work you've done with us. And it was exciting to see you were going to be on this panel. So Anne, you are up, and let's see if we can get your slides up too.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Paul, for such a good lead into this discussion. Okay. All right. I guess I can be heard. I see the slides. Good morning, everyone. At least good morning from where I'm calling, which is out in Oakland, California. It's a real pleasure for me to get to join you this morning. I've looked through the participant list, and I see some my former fellow commissioners, and it's really nice to be with you and share some of the insights that we've gained at Sunrun. And listening to Paul and looking at the agenda that you have for the next few days, I think probably the most important thing I can do is to give some examples of some of this work that's being done at the, really at the local level, some of those DERs that I guess are causing the need for the coordination that we're all going to be talking about. So I'm going to, give you some examples and then some thoughts of, of ours and how we can continue to move this forward. So if you could move to the slide. So just a couple of things. I'm going to also talk about the real impacts that we're responding to and why I think it is so urgent and critical that we move forward with some changes to our planning and changes to the way that we're going to be coordinating our energy supplies and at the distribution at the wholesale level. And then, as I said, give you some examples of what we're doing and how we see options for coordination. Next. So as I mentioned, I'm out here in California, and we've had a really challenging few years. I moved out here after I finished on the Maryland Commission. We have just, in this last couple of months had forced rolling blackouts because of one, forced blackouts, either because of fire concerns. There were some down in Southern California just this last weekend. There were some over Thanksgiving, but also rolling blackouts later in the late part of the summer due to concerns about capacity. And, as a distributed solar and storage provider, we were called by our commission here to ask if we could make sure that our customers could, share their power at certain times or not take power from the grid. And it was really illuminating, I guess, not to have a pun, but it showed us, and I think you'll see from this quote, which I think came from former FERC Commissioner John Wellinghoff in an article he wrote, that, a lot of distributed batteries were actually called up, informally, because they really weren't integrated. We really aren't integrated in the way we could be to be a solution. And we know now that, more than 30,000 distributed batteries helped on the 14th of August to help, prevent problems. But there were actually, more than 530 megawatts of distributed batteries on the grid that could have been more efficiently utilized. And so this is just the beginning too. I mean, we have people out installing batteries today, right? I mean, customers want this technology, it's growing, and it's a resource that is not fully incorporated into planning or into compensation mechanisms that can really provide essential benefits, not just for the customers who go out and make that investment, but for the grid as a whole. And that's certainly what we're seeing out here. Next. So just to give you an idea of how this growth is happening, here's a chart from Wood Mackenzie that, we saw that, year over year, we're seeing, significant growth in residential, which is, Sunrun is a residential provider, residential batteries. And again, I think that, the analysts all predict that this is going to continue to grow as more and more customers. Well, one is the price of batteries come down, as more customers want control over their energy, and as there are more opportunities, such as like, the 2222 order and state policies and state incentives. And, contrast that, with the fact, unfortunately, that until we get these incentives and compensation right, more than 3 million homeowners have gone out and bought fossil generators to give them the backup they need, either in the Northeast against hurricanes or out here with fires. And it's really discouraging to me, because I firmly believe that it's the climate problems, the carbon problems that we're having that are leading to our climate challenges. And we have the technology now. We just need to have the policy, the incentives to catch up, honestly, and really do it with urgency, because we don't want people going out and contributing to the, further to this problem. But that's where we are right now. If we can't, move forward with this more quickly, people take the situation in their own hands and they go out and they buy fossil generators for their homes, which are also not that safe. So, we found that the residential market, fortunately, has shown remarkable resiliency in the face of these COVID lockdowns, which in California we're facing again, as we are in much of the country. And, what we've seen with that too, is that customers also are realizing just how valuable and essential it is for them to have reliable power at their homes. So this is going to drive demand for these resources, and it provides an opportunity for policymakers to coordinate those resources, as we'll see, and bring value to the larger grid. Next. So as I'm showing here, the scale, the cost of technology declines. And we have seen some tremendous, declines in the cost of solar, distributed solar, but also solar and storage since, over the last decade, storage much more recently. And, our expectations, as you'll see here, those costs are going to continue to fall. And as they do, they cross over the costs of grid provided energy, and it's already happened certainly in Hawaii, in California, and increasingly towards Texas. And so again, what this says to us is that we know with technology, and as particularly as you add in EVs and the battery demand and development there, that the cost will continue to fall. And that, I think, means one great opportunity, but also, again, the real importance for us to get the planning right, to plan for these resources in our grids, and also to be careful about bringing on a lot of utility scale resources and centralized, relying too much on centralized distribution planning when we know that people and demand are going to drive increasing amounts of these distributed resources on the grid. Next. So there was a study that came out last week that I really hope everybody hopefully saw. There was a good article in Green Tech Media, I think on Friday, a study that really looked at how we can save a lot of money, billions of dollars, by just really changing the way that we plan, by recognizing and bringing into the planning this expected growth of distributed resources and taking that into account. It actually increases the it reduces the cost of the grid is the outcome of this study, but it also increases the opportunity for more utility scale clean energy resources by essentially evening out the variability on the grid, recognizing that as you get more and more distributed resources, they're able to meet local demands more efficiently and take out some of the need for the costly and often fossil fueled peaking type generation and resources. It's a really interesting study. It was done by a group called Vibrant Clean Energy. And I think that we could probably get a link and send it around. It just came out last week, and it really is focused on planning and how if we we have to make sure that we don't just hold on to the traditional ways that we have thought about planning for our grid and our distribution grid in particular, but recognize that we may need some new tools and incorporation of different types of data, and that the outcome can save literally hundreds of billions of dollars. Next. And here you'll see, some of the examples of the charts that are in that study, and basically, they optimize. If you optimize for local DERs versus the business as usual case, that the savings are significant, but they're particularly significant when you add in some of the clean energy goals that are very ambitious in states across the country, and you figure out how you're going to meet those goals. The costs the cost savings are significant if you actually figure out how to optimize the local resources along with the utility scale resources. And then, of course, there's many jobs that can be created in the process, which is another urgent need given all the challenges that we faced with the COVID crisis. Next. So here's some examples, of some of the work that we've been doing at Sunrun, and it really has been exciting. And one of the messages I like to leave you with is just this is happening so quickly, and I'm sure you're all aware of that as regulators. But when I left the Maryland Commission and came here 4 years ago, we weren't even putting batteries on. None of these examples I'm giving you were even, I think, thought of at the time. So it's just moving incredibly fast. And so we've basically put together an energy services platform, which we view as a battery sharing economy for the customer and the grid. And we're working with a number of different entities, or I guess, pathways to move forward this, opportunity to share the resources beyond our customers. One is directly with investor-owned utilities. We've had agreements with, as you'll see up on this, number of utilities across the country. We just announced a significant one with Southern Cal Edison a couple of weeks ago. We have a really exciting project I'll talk about with Hawaiian Electric. And so basically these tend to be essentially demand response type programs, or what we'll call bring your own device, where a utility and a commission obviously will approve this, having a tariff where customers can get a battery from a third-party provider and then have benefits from that when called upon from the utilities. And we're working, where we can to collaborate with utilities to bring these resources to the value of what they need to meet the demands of their customers. And then in the markets, we did we were accepted into New England ISO a couple of years ago, and we're in the process of building out that capacity requirement throughout New England, where our, I think, 5,000 batteries are committed to be called as part of the capacity product, New England ISO. And obviously, we're very excited about the 2222 order and what that might mean for some of the other markets. We're also obviously working with Cal ISO out here. And then another very exciting, I'd say, development in California is the work of the community choice aggregators that are really working to try to find local alternatives to meet, and often clean energy alternatives. And so we have reached agreements with a number of the CCAs where we are doing joint marketing with them, joint information to customers, but also helping them meet their local capacity needs. So as you can see, lots of activity on a number of different fronts, which again, just goes to the need to be able to coordinate as all of this is going on, at the same time. Next. Next slide. Okay. Not sure what's going on with the slides.
Carrie, is there a problem with the slide? Anne, I can hear you and you can hear me, so I hope everybody in the background can also hear us.
I can try to remember what comes next. Let's see. While we're waiting to see what happens, I can talk a little bit about what I believe comes on the next couple of slides. I don't have them on me right now. One of the ones that I did want to talk about was in the CCA category, and I think it's a really good example of what, whoops, here we go. Nope, I'm seeing you now, Commissioner. Are you hearing me?
I think my colleague Dominic has experienced some technical difficulties, so I'm going to bring up your slides. Hang on.
Oh, thanks, Carrie.
And Anne, just so you know, the next slide was going to be Sunrun's partnership with SCE and the virtual power plant.
Right. So I'm just going to give, because we're going to run out of some time. I'll give you some examples of what you're going to see. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, we've reached some arrangements. Some of them that I think are really very interesting, and one of our first ones out here is in Oakland with one of the CCAs, East Bay Community Energy. And, we have an issue here in Oakland where there's a very old jet fueled fired power plant in a very, I'd say, high priority environmental justice area. Oh, let's see if we can do it right there. We can talk about that. And the CCA has worked with the local utility, PG&E, with us, with another energy company to try to look for an alternative where they can, discontinue use of that plant, which is a peaking plant. It's not used all the time, but when it's used, it's very inefficient and polluting in a community that already suffers from a lot of environmental justice challenges. And so we are, our part of this is to put rooftop solar and batteries on multifamily housing that will serve 500 low-income housing units. And, this is an example where, again, you've got local organizations or local now CCAs that are essentially supported by their local governments, trying to figure out a way to transform the energy system to one that's more reliable and also cleaner. And we're able to do this by pooling these resources through virtual power plants. Next. In HECO, or in Hawaii, we're in a program with HECO and OATI, where we are going to be installing 1,000 Sunrun Bright boxes into a virtual power plant. And it's going to provide a couple of values, right? It's going to provide capacity grid services, which can be, we can receive a signal from HECO to be available during their peak period, and also frequency response. We're able to give our customers enrollment incentives to be part of this. We're also, as part of it, donating a portion, to a local charity, and then customers are getting bill credits as well. So, we are now going to be going out, across Hawaii, talking to customers, explaining how they can benefit from this, but also provide a benefit to the grid so that HECO and Hawaii do not have to rely on more centralized and more expensive sources of power capacity and frequency response. Next. Carrie, can you get to the next one? Yeah, great. And then, as I mentioned, we've actually had 2 partnerships already with Southern Cal Electric, and they made a big announcement today. You'll probably see in the press where it's, it was Sunrun at this most recent announcement. Sunrun is going to be providing 5 megawatts over the next few years of capacity to the grid for SCE to meet their capacity requirements. And then they're also entering into agreements for centralized batteries, out, not at the residential level. And, obviously this is really critical given the challenges that I've mentioned in California, that, we have alternatives to just provide a more resilient grid. And so basically what we're doing there is going out again, we'll be marketing to our customers these batteries, and then we will aggregate them and serve as the aggregator, as you heard about, in the FERC discussion earlier, and responding to signals from Southern Cal Electric and being, a source of capacity that they can use to prevent challenges when the grid is strained. Next. So, I think this is a really hard chart to read, so you can just take it with you. But, as we've heard before, there are many benefits, we believe, to distributed energy. And what we're seeing is that there are benefits, obviously, to customer, to society from cleaner energy, but also to the distribution system from reliability, resiliency, power quality, saving on distribution losses by generating close to the home, reducing some of the needs for sub-transmission, substation, feeder capacity, and then also at the wholesale level, right? By, being able to provide ancillary services, being able to reduce the need for transmission, meeting some of the RPS requirements, resource adequacy. So what we're seeing is that there are benefits at multiple levels here, but you're really only going to get them if we figure out how to coordinate them and how to optimize them. And I think that's what a lot of these discussions in the next few days are about, right? I think people are recognizing now it's not just the customer who's getting the benefit of putting that solar and battery on their homes. So how do we get it optimized so that we can get the right amounts of it in the right places? Next. I think, Paul covered some of this, but this, I think, gives you a nice kind of schematic or picture of what we're looking at here and why it is a challenge facing us, right? I mean, the transmission grid, I think, is, one we have a lot of experience with that. But when you get to the distribution grid, beyond the substation transmission distribution interface, we have lots of different, valuable things being developed out on the distribution network. And, obviously we're focused on solar and batteries, but we've got increasing amounts of EVs. We've got some just batteries alone. We've got thermostats and, even some distributed wind. So, it is really critical that we figure out how to bring those together and make sure that they're coordinated with that intersection with the transmission system. Next. And so I think I'm sort of going to pass over this because I think Paul covered it, but, basically the idea is, if you look to the right, that, by having a DSO in the middle, you can minimize some of those challenges that Paul laid out and make sure that you're able to really, miss some of those latency and other kind of coordination issues that could cause problems as this gets more complicated. Next. Here's a picture one of my team members shared with me that just shows from 2013 to 2016, that as we started to get more DERs on the system, if you don't have the right kind of coordination or you try to do it just from the TSO, we don't think you're going to get an optimized, an optimized solution. That you really want to make sure that you've got a plan and some control at the distribution level to make sure that we can minimize these kind of challenges. Next. So in our view, we think the answer is the total DSO coordination model. Paul had laid out the 3. I know we're sort of more in a hybrid role right now. There's a really good article written by Dave Roberts at Vox, I think maybe about a year ago. I think that's where we got this picture from, but kind of lays out the option, the opportunity here. And, we think that with the DSO model, you can ensure, power quality and reliability, are maintained, and it can, coordinate load both at normal and abnormal conditions, and facilitate grid services, which we think are very valuable, and load shaping, and just do it in a more orderly way, where we can have these two important levels of our markets coordinate. Next. I'm going to kind of skip over this too for time, but a couple of the areas, we know you're all really busy trying to get your arms around this. Some of the ones that we've been engaged with, California has a number of investigations going on, dealing with DSO platform providers. Some certainly coming out of the extreme weather events that we've had, certainly put a sense of urgency on this. And some distributed energy resource deferral tariffs. So there's a lot going on in California. New York, I asked for information on New York from my team because when I was started at the commission in 2013, we couldn't go to a session that we did not hear about New York Rev, right? I don't think that language is used quite as much anymore, but the point is New York has been thinking about this for a long time, and about the whole issue of how do you have markets that can, be animated with competitive resources, and, what that's going to look like. I think obviously New York has some other, initiatives underway on market design and integration, between the distribution level and the wholesale level. And, I think, we know there's a lot of activities going in many of your states. So I just, flag these two for you, but certainly Hawaii is doing a very systematic look at their system, as well as I know Rhode Island's been, thinking about this for a long time too. So, you guys, obviously looking to what each other's doing, learning from this, and sharing information, is really critically valuable at this time. Next. And I just want to end with something that we're thinking about. And, I'm excited. I hope I can tune into some of the sessions tomorrow where I heard about things like transactive energy. Where we see this going, people talk a lot about microgrids, which, there's quite a bit of work going on, but we're thinking of something we would refer to as a neighborhood grid, which again is very focused on resiliency and reliability. And it's looking at the opportunity now that we do have increasing amounts of distributed resources locally between, cars, solar, batteries, et cetera. What are our opportunities for disconnecting a neighborhood from the distribution grid when there is an outage, or when, when a transmission line has to be shut down because of fear of fire? How can we disconnect from that? And how can you use, for instance, energy storage sited at the substation to essentially enable that from substation down to the neighborhood to disconnect from the grid? So, in this case, you would have switchgear disconnecting from the transmission grid, creating a distribution island, right? So different than how you might normally think of a microgrid, but this is actually neighborhood, distribution island. And then you use the substation energy storage to re-energize the feeder circuit long enough so that the DERs can sustain the island, right? And you wouldn't need DERs for every house. Sometimes we hear complaints about, why do some customers get incentives for distributed resources when not everyone can have it? Well, this concept is you don't actually need everyone to have it to keep this grid energized and to make sure you can have essential services in these communities. And, there's work to be done on that. We're working with, wanting to work with utilities, wanting to work with regulators. But the truth is that, we absolutely need to look for solutions to share these valuable resources and to recognize that, we are in a challenging time, and that I think, now's the time for us to work together to find how to get the right regulations in place, get the right incentives in place, and to optimize our grid. So thanks so much for the opportunity to talk with you all today.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was really helpful. We are going to actually close out poll number 1 in just a minute. While they're bringing that up, I'm going to pose a question to Anne and Paul that you'll answer after we see those poll results. Both of you talked about distribution system operators. In your opinion, what entity is best suited to run it? The utility, an independent entity, something else? So right now we're showing the poll results from the beginning. Actually, this is actually interesting. Most people, this is their first NCEP meeting. We're very glad to have you, by the way. I think we've been putting on some quality programming and hope today and the next couple of days really cement your loyalty to us. And it looks like the biggest population we have is from the state agencies. I think at this time, Danielle will open up a new poll. And so back to Anne and Paul. I'll start with Paul first. For a DSO, who do you think should be operating it?
I think that practically speaking, where we're starting from would be the distribution utility. And I actually think that that would continue. But I do think that there are a couple of specific things that would be necessary. One is we would need to have a code of conduct, not unlike what we have in between transmission operations and wholesale market operations inside a utility. That is what would be the distribution market operation dimension. That is the retail function would need to be separated from the distribution operator function. And then I think the other thing that's brought up is, the equivalent of essentially open access, which I believe in most states we already have the equivalent of FERC's open access tariff with what's been done with various tariffs and also rules in various states to enable DER interconnection and the like, and particularly as it's been enhanced over the last 5 years or so. So I think for the most part, we have open access at distribution for distributed resources, certainly now with the ability to participate in markets, and in many states, obviously pursuing non-wires alternative options. So I think we're pretty much have the prerequisites, other than perhaps this clear line between the operators, system operators at distribution, and any of the retail functions. I think if those were, clear in terms of I'd say a code of conduct, then I think we're in pretty good shape.
Thank you. And Anne, would you like to answer that from your perspective?
Yeah, Paul covered it really well. My view is that, it would make the most sense, at least at this point, for the distribution utilities to play that role. I think it's a really, important role for an opportunity, right, for the utilities to sort of, add to their responsibilities in the sense of I view them as kind of being the conductor of this orchestra. But I absolutely agree with Paul that it's going to require a very strong code of conduct and really clear recognition that, many utilities consider distributed resources as competitors to their traditional model. Unfortunately, while I think it is true there's open access for distributed resources, we're seeing a lot of barriers, particularly for storage, a lot of costs, a lot of, challenges in terms of, claims about burdens it's putting on the network. And that brings me back to that planning study that I shared at the beginning of my presentation. We see that there's actually value and opportunity to take burdens off the grid through these resources. But when the planning is all done by the utilities, and if they view DERs as competition, it gets challenging. So, I see it as a great opportunity for utilities to play in this future, but we've got to recognize and make sure that we really have strong rules for interconnection timelines and making sure that we can keep this progress moving forward.
Thank you. We're getting some audience questions too. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to answer them all, but here's one that's directed to you, Anne, about your slide on microgrids. Could this be used in a vertically integrated model without an RTO ISO if the LSE manages the microgrid from its substation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that necessarily requires the RTO. I'll have to, was that the one from Commissioner Rendell? I saw something
Yes,
pop up.
it is.
I may want to take that back and just like ask with our folks who are working on that if there'd be any problem with that. But I mean, really, the idea is, you know, as I said in part of the presentation, some of what we're doing is just with utilities. It's not really involving the RTOs or ISOs at this point, right? It's responding to the distribution or resource adequacy needs that these utilities have. So I don't see why that couldn't be the case, but I will go back and confirm.
Maybe just to point the commissioner to pose the question, you might take a look at the Hawaii microgrid tariff for community microgrids, that is front of the meter and even behind the meter DER. They're creating a local microgrid. So they are heading in that direction in Hawaii, and you might take a look at the draft tariff if you want to see some specifics. And there was a technical conference last week. I don't know if it was recorded and is available, but there was some good Q&A as part of that might be helpful as well.
Thank you. I have one that might be fun for both of you. Why do you think there's such a divergence of how state utility commissions and or state legislatures treat net metering compensation rates? Politics or results of different jurisdictions having different benefits and costs? This is probably a loaded question, but it sounded like a lot of fun. Do you each want to take 2 minutes on that?
Sure, I'll take it. I spend a lot of time on net metering. I unfortunately think there is a lot of politics. I think a lot of it comes down to the competition issue I just mentioned. When you look at the actual impacts, since in most states, net distributed resources is still very small. We hope it keeps growing, but there's a really interesting, I think, LBNL study, or maybe, yeah, I think it was LBNL a couple of years ago, which just showed, the real costs and impacts and cost shifts are really coming from huge investments in the centralized, system, our older system. And so, we have a lot of concerns about the way the issue is discussed. That aside, I think then when you actually get into a case and you look at the costs and benefits, as you saw the chart on my presentation, of which there are many costs at 3 different levels, and opportunity for more, not cost benefits, but opportunity for more with proper optimization. But sometimes in states, they're very limited, to what they believe. The regulators are limited in what they believe they can consider as benefits. So an example that, I always thought about in Maryland, and we had a pretty broad statutory, basis for considering public interest impacts. But, if you're just looking at the impact on the distribution grid and you're assuming that those costs are a given and fixed, and whatever costs utilities put in, and you reduce kilowatt hours, whether it's energy efficiency or distributed resources, it's going to look like it's an impact on the remaining ratepayers. But if you look a little broader and you consider, well, what if we can avoid a transmission line? What if we can avoid, a dirty power plant that's even broader, right? Which is arguably beyond what regulators get to do. But if you think of this power plant down in Oakland that is, causing a lot of harm to people who live there, so if you start looking and can include some of the societal benefits or even benefits outside of just the distribution system, most studies show that the benefits of these resources outweigh the costs. But that's where we get into in these cases. And we have a few big ones coming up this year, so I may be seeing some of you. But, I think the other point is that, net metering was a system that was put in place to be simple for customers, to encourage customers to make this investment, that they could understand it. And so we also are very focused on trying to make sure that the regulations that come out can be understood, because that's the only way customers are going to embrace this and then also be willing to share their investment by not having, kind of punitive rate structures. So that's enough for my end. It was a nice question. Thank you.
And Paul, you would have 1 minute if you want to have any kind of weigh in on this one.
Yeah, I think so. I think just building on it, I think it's important to understand where a particular state is and in its evolution with more distributed resources on net energy metering. So those states that are farther along in terms of adoption with higher levels have been looking at sort of next generation. Where do they go next in terms of tariff structure? States like California and Hawaii obviously have a lot of distributed resources, particularly rooftop solar PV. And so part of the look there is how do they start to address some of those additional benefits that Ann talked about, but at the same time also recognizing that when the energy is being produced is better suited towards what the overall system needs. So things like introducing time of use or compensation for the energy, excess energy, as in the case of Hawaii, starting to look at a time of use dimension so that you don't sort of exacerbate the duck curve problem, and you try and orient, which also then ties into where the value of storage can come into play as well in terms of helping to shape that. So depending on where a state is and what it's trying to accomplish from an overall system, so that it's much more of an active part and creating additional value is part of what the tariff conversations have been about.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And I have to say that we obviously are going to have to look at our future system with kind of a new lens than we have in the past. Thank you, Ann and Paul, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us.